I'm going to, as Steve said, tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing trying to reconstruct the history of the Asian monsoon system from Chinese speleothems. And this is work that I've done for my PhD and my postdoc, and I'm continuing to do today. So I realize that some of you might not be familiar with the monsoon or with speleothems, so I'm going to introduce you to both of those. And then I'm going to spend some time going over some records of Asian monsoon history from speleothem oxygen isotope records. And then, if we have time, hopefully, I will spend some time explaining work that we've been doing on trying to test and develop new proxies and speleothems that might tell us about how seasonality in the monsoon region has varied in the past. So the Asian monsoon system is shown here, and like all monsoon systems, it's characterized by a seasonal reversal of pressure gradients. Essentially what happens during the winter is that the continent cools down much more relative to the surrounding seas, and therefore we have a high pressure system that develops over Siberia and relatively low pressure here, and so you generate these northwesterly offshore winds, and associated with that circulation is very dry conditions and very little rainfall at that time. During the summer, however, the continent heats up much more quickly relative to the surrounding oceans, and that pressure gradient reverses. We have low pressure developing over the continents, high pressure over the oceans, and so you get onshore winds which carry lots of moisture into the Asian monsoon region. And this is just showing you the section of the East Asian monsoon, but there's also the Indian monsoon, which is closely related to this system. And so in most monsoon affected regions, about 80% of the summer rainfall will occur during the months of June, July, and August. And that's true for the sites I'll show you today. Okay, so the monsoon system is, while it's remarkably regular on the seasonal timescale, it comes every year, more or less. If you look back in time, there are certain sedimentary records which can tell us about monsoon history. One of the best records of this from China is the record that's preserved in a very thick sequence of windblown dust, the Less Paleocene record. So this is a sequence of windblown dust which is deposited during the winter monsoon and then is punctuated with periods of soil formation, which are shown here. So this is a nearly 2 million year record of alternating periods of loess deposition and soil formation in this region. And what was initially noticed from this record is that if you look at it versus, plotted here we have marine delta 018 stages, which essentially are showing changes in global ice volume. So on the left here we have the cold glacial periods, and on the right here we have the warmer interglacial periods. And what was initially noted was that during warmer periods, we tend to have periods of soil formation indicating wetter conditions at that time. And so in general, then, the cold periods are characterized by a weak summer monsoon and a strong winter monsoon. And then the warmer periods, globally, are characterized by a strong summer monsoon and a weak winter monsoon. So you have this sort of seesaw-like effect. The problem with the Less record, though, is that the sedimentation rates are very low, and so you can't get very high-resolution climate data out of this type of deposit. So the question is, what about higher frequency monsoon variability that might be more likely to occur on human timescales? And of course, the reason why we're interested in how the monsoon varies in the past is because the people living in monsoon regions, which is over half of the world's population, are highly dependent on that monsoon rainfall. And currently, even interannual variations in the amount of monsoon rainfall or in the timing of the monsoon rainfall can have significant impacts on people living in these regions, with even slightly stronger than average monsoons leading to flooding in large regions in Asia. And then relatively dry monsoon years can lead to devastating droughts and famines. So one other archive that can be useful for reconstructing the monsoon history, as it turns out, are these cave deposits, or speleothems, in addition to a number of other proxy records, which we might look at to learn about the monsoon. But I'm going to focus on speleothems today. And speleothems, as you can look, if you focus over here on the left, speleothems are formed as rain falling hits the soil where it encounters elevated CO2 pressure. It's probably you're mostly familiar with. And this creates a weak carbonic acid, which then infiltrates through a limestone or dolomite bedrock, dissolves calcium carbonate, and becomes supersaturated with calcium carbonate. And then when that drip water enters a cave atmosphere, CO2 degassing occurs because the PCO2 in the cave air is less than that in the groundwater. And so this dissolution reaction essentially operates in reverse, and you precipitate layers of calcium carbonate. And for paleoclimatology, the samples that we tend to look at are these nicely columnar laminated calcite stalagmites, which are the ones growing up from the floor. And that's primarily because they have the most clear stratigraphy and the most constant growth rates. So there's a number of reasons why these things are useful for looking at past climates. One is that they often form with annual laminations that you can see under a microscope or even in hand samples. And one of the most important reasons why these are incredibly useful is that we can actually date them very precisely using uranium-thorium methods, which I'm not going to go into detail about, but relative to some other paleoclimate archives, terrestrial paleoclimate archives, this method has many advantages over some of the dating methods that we apply to like lake records, for instance. They also tend to be very pure and well preserved, and they come from these caves, which are pretty sheltered environments. And also, very importantly, they contain a number of physical and geochemical indicators which reflect the climate at the time that they formed. Of those, the two most commonly measured are delta O18 and delta C13, stable isotope composition of the calcite. And in this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on delta O18. And then they also contain trace element variations, which are reflecting hydrological changes or perhaps temperature in some cases. And then there's a number of other isotope systems which people are working on calibrating, which may provide further information. So we can look at multiple proxies at once and therefore get more robust paleoclimate data. And also just looking at the laminations themselves, sometimes you can measure the growth rate of those samples and as a function of climate and such things as that. Okay, so focusing on the speleothem delta O18, the delta O18 of calcite, or of anything really, is defined here as the oxygen 18 to 16 ratio in a sample relative to that in a standard, expressed as parts per thousand or per mil. And assuming that the calcite precipitates in equilibrium with that drip water, which is generally the case in caves, the delta 18 of calcite then is a function only of the composition of the water and of the cave temperature. So there's a temperature-dependent fractionation between the water and the calcite. So the approach that we tend to use then, of course, is we actually measure the delta 18 of the calcite in a mass spectrometer. And then this cave temperature effect on the calcite delta 18 is fairly well known. It's relatively small compared to some of the variations that we see in the speleothem. So essentially, as you increase temperature, by 1 degree Celsius, you would decrease the delta 18 by about 0.24 per mil per degree C. So in tropical and monsoon regions where the annual temperature changes are pretty small, for example, during the glacial, this could maybe explain a per mil or so of change in the speleothem. However, we see much bigger variations in the speleothem composition, and it turns out that most of those are reflecting changes in the delta 18 of the water itself. So in a sense, the speleothems are often can be thought of as being fossilized water in the same way that an ice core is directly frozen water. the delta 18 of a speleothem is largely controlled by the delta 18 of the water. So then the question becomes, of course, what actually controls the delta 18 of the water then in terms of climate? And what can we learn from that? Well, first of all, the first step is that the drip water in the cave, in most cases, and we always check this by studying the modern cave systems, the drip water is essentially reflecting, in most cases, the annual average delta 18 of rainfall at a given location. So that's good. And then we know that there are several controls on rainfall delta 18, but the two most important ones are temperature, where you get a positive correlation between temperature and delta 18, and rainfall amount, where you get a negative correlation with rainfall delta 18. So wetter conditions lead to more negative delta 18, and positive high temperatures lead to more positive delta 18s. Well, I've done some statistical analysis of rainfall delta 18 data for China in order to investigate the relative importance of these two effects. And what we found wasn't too surprising, and it's been shown in other studies and in other regions for other monsoon regions and for the tropics, that in these regions, this rainfall amount effect, this negative change in delta 18 with increased rainfall is the most significant. So for speleothems then, we can assume that the delta 18 in the monsoon region is reflecting rainfall amount, and therefore in the speleothems, if you see a high or more positive delta 18, then that would indicate a weaker monsoon or less rainfall. And if you see a really negative delta 18, that would represent a strong monsoon or more rainfall. And this is a bit of an oversimplification, and I'm happy to discuss this more in detail if anyone's interested. But in general, this is how the speleothem records from this site are interpreted. So now that we have our proxy, we can think about what questions we actually want to address. And so there's several questions about the monsoon. Some of the key ones we could look at are, what are the mechanisms that control the monsoon variability on a range of timescales? So on orbital, sort of Milankovitch timescales, all the way down to seasonal timescales. And what is the relationship with certain coupled climate modes, such as El Nino, Southern Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the Indian Ocean Dipole. So because we can get such high resolution records from these, we can potentially address these questions. And then, how has the frequency, duration, and or magnitude of extreme monsoon events varied in the past? And then the ultimate question, of course, is we want to know if these variations are predictable, if we can use this information to improve climate models, and to answer how climate change will affect the stability of the monsoon in the future. However, I'm also a geochemist, and so therefore I'm interested in actually developing and testing these proxies to actually improve the quality of the climate data that we get from these speleothems. So some of the questions we can ask about speleothem geochemistry with my research are, what are the main physical and environmental controls on the speleothem geochemistry? Are there seasonal biases that exist in the records? And we need to identify these if so. And also, how do these controls vary when we're looking at different timescales? Okay, so the study areas that I primarily work in are shown here in red. Heshang Cave here is near the northern limit of the summer monsoon. And Heshang Cave, shown here, is in the central Yangtze River Valley in a site that's highly influenced by monsoon rainfall. So Heshang Cave gets about a third of the annual rainfall as Heshang, but they both are strongly dominated by that summertime monsoon rainfall. I've also shown the location of 3 other caves, which I'm going to show you some data from, which have come from work out of Larry Edwards' group, which are Hulu Cave, Sanbao Cave, and Donga Cave. Okay, so this is a record that was published last year in Nature, which is truly an amazing compilation of speleothem data, and this came out of Larry Edwards' group in Minnesota, and this was published by Wang et al. And this is showing you here now, each of the different colors represents a different stalagmite, which have all been sort of spliced together to give a 220,000-year-long record of the monsoon. Shown here, the delta 18 axis is reversed, so the more negative values indicating the wetter conditions, remember, are towards the top, and the more positive values indicating drier conditions are towards the bottom. Plotted in light gray, if you can see that back there, is a northern hemisphere summer insolation for 65 degrees north. And essentially, what is very clear from seeing this is an amazing correlation between the delta 18, or the monsoon intensity, and summer insolation. And this is dominantly showing this 23,000-year precession type cycle in the monsoon, which is as expected for low and mid-latitude regions, where just changing the amount of radiation due to changes in the Earth orbit that is falling in the northern hemisphere summer will directly influence the monsoon because it directly affects that temperature gradient and that pressure gradient. So during high insolation, we get strong monsoons. Low insolation, we get more dry monsoons. I'm not going to talk much about the bottom here, but this is just another record of the delta 18 of atmospheric oxygen, which shows a similar pattern. In any case, it's clear that insolation is the dominant driver of monsoon variability on these long time scales. But if you look in detail, there's many large wiggles superimposed on this record. And so one of the questions we want to look at is what actually is causing that higher frequency variability. And that question brings us to what the monsoon response is to these abrupt climate events that have happened in the past. There's a number of abrupt climate changes that happened during the last glacial, known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events, for example. And these events, if you look at the bottom here, this is showing these abrupt events in the Greenland ice core record, which is a temperature record, essentially, showing these sort of abrupt warmings that happened during the last glacial period. And the upper two panels show you two different speleothem records, one from the Indian monsoon region and one from the East Asian monsoon region, which show that along with these abrupt increases in temperature in Greenland, we had abrupt increases in monsoon intensity occurring essentially synchronously, indicating a link between the monsoon region and high latitude climate. Trying to understand what that link, the mechanism that links that is, it's most likely linked to something like ocean circulation, which affects atmospheric circulation patterns over Europe and Asia. One clue as to what is causing these abrupt changes, or what they're actually reflecting, can be gotten from looking at these two records shown here now. This is a Heshang Cave record. Sorry, I apologize for all the wiggly lines you're about to see. There's more. This is the Heshang Cave record in red now, plotted with a record from Bodavira Cave in Brazil, actually. And what you'll notice here is that these two axes are opposite from one another. So when we have wet conditions in China, shown here in red, we are actually characterized by drier conditions in Brazil, and vice versa. And even on these sort of short timescales, when you look at these abrupt events here, you see a very much an anti-phase behavior between rainfall in China and rainfall in Brazil. So this suggests that perhaps what's being recorded by these abrupt events is actually changes in the position of the intertropical convergence zone, which is this band of heavy rainfall around the equator. And there's modeling studies which suggest that this anti-phase behavior could be directly linked to changes in ocean circulation and in the amount of sea ice and northern hemisphere ice cover. So I'll come back to that in a second. Just to show you one of the records in detail of an abrupt event, one of these abrupt warmings, as shown in this speleothem from Heshang Cave. This section up here is where this data is from, which is during marine isotope stage 5B and 5A, sort of the last bit of the last interglacial period was characterized by this fairly abrupt warming around 86,000 years ago. And you can see that warming in the Greenland ice core record, and even in Antarctic ice cores somewhat, although the timing of this part is a bit uncertain in the ice core records. But down here you can see a corresponding decrease in rainfall in Brazil, again, the same as we saw in the comparison of that other record. And what is essentially a 4 per mil or more change in delta 18, which is quite a large change, which occurred over the course of a couple of centuries or so. So some of these changes can happen very fast, certainly on timescales that would affect humans. Okay, so if you look at, again, at the ITCZ migration shown here, you can see that during the summertime months, this band of heavy precipitation, this is showing you monthly rainfall now, this band of heavy precipitation migrates north and south with the seasons and is situated towards the summertime hemisphere. So during the northern hemisphere summer, when the Asian monsoon is strong, the whole ITCZ is located farther north, and whereas it shifts farther south during the northern hemisphere winter. And so this completely explains why you might get anti-phase behavior. When it's dry over here in Brazil, it's wet over here in China, and vice versa. So if you can impose a more, rather than just a seasonal change in that position, if you can impose a longer-term shift in the mean position of that rainfall band, that would have this effect. And as I said, a number of climate models have shown this. For example, modeling the last glacial maximum, where we had a significant amount of northern hemisphere ice cover and sea ice up here. Ocean circulation was a bit slower. Overturning circulation of the Atlantic was a bit slower. This shows you that we had a positive rainfall anomaly in the south and a negative rainfall anomaly towards the north in these two bands. And so this is indicating that the whole ITCZ shifted south at that time. Okay, so one question is, we've seen a lot of these abrupt climate events that occur during glacial periods, but there's less known about the capacity for the climate to shift abruptly during warm periods. The Holocene, the last 10,000 years of this interglacial, have been relatively calm compared to the glacial, but there's still maybe some evidence for some fairly rapid changes in rainfall during interglacial periods. And to address that, we've looked at a Holocene stalagmite from Heshang Cave in China, and this is a pretty amazing sample shown here next to Chaoyang Hu, who's our main collaborator in China, who collected this sample in 2001. It's a 2.5 meter long stalagmite, and it turns out that it's annually laminated throughout its whole section, and grew at a very high growth rate of 300 microns per year. So, began growing around 9,500 years ago. Shown over here are the uranium-thorium dates in red, plotted versus distance from the top. And in blue is the results of annual laminate counts that were done by, thankfully done by Chinese master students who counted every layer in this sample repeatedly to confirm that, in fact, the bands were annual, and also to help confirm the uranium-thorium chronology. So it's very well dated. Just to show you a couple pictures of Heshang Cave and how difficult it was to get a 2.5 meter stalagmite out of there. This is the transportation that you have to take to the cave, up the river about a mile or so. And I'm not even sure how they managed to get a stalagmite onto a boat like this without sinking it. But in any case, they got it, and some other ones as well. And this is approaching the cave entrance right here. So it has a single large entrance and is a relatively small, simple cave that just heads straight back underneath this ridge here. Okay, so now shown here in red is the delta 18 from the HS4 sample over the Holocene. And you can see that there's a range of a few per mil in delta 18 over the Holocene. And down here in the bottom in blue is a similar record, a similar resolution record from Heshang Cave, which was published by Wang et al. In 2005. And this Heshang Cave is not too far away from Heshang, so we would expect to see quite similar variations between the two sites if we're actually representing regional rainfall. And in fact, we do, to a first degree anyway. If you can, this gray line here is showing the July insolation again at 65 degrees north, showing this sort of orbital influence on the monsoon, where during the mid and early Holocene, we had more negative values at both sites. And as insolation decreased towards the present, we had, again, a decrease in monsoon intensity over that time. But again, there's significant decadal and centennial scale fluctuations in these records, some of which are common between the two and some of which aren't. And some of these events can be tied to things like Welder pulses, for example. The 8.2 kiloyear event is seen around the northern hemisphere as a period of relatively cool conditions due to an outburst flood event in the North Atlantic that slowed down ocean circulation, most likely. And that's seen here and here as a short period of decreased monsoon intensity at these sites. Other events in the Holocene, such as a relatively rapid drop in monsoon intensity around 4.8 to 4.1 thousand years ago, shown here. You can see a sort of step-like drop here. Is seen somewhat in this record as well, and that's actually seen in a number of other paleoclimate records from this region. The reasons for that drop are less clear. It could be related to a mid-Holocene increase in El Nino events, potentially. But in any case, this is a period of very abrupt drying. I'm not going to go through every little wiggle on here, but there are a few other things which are seen in common between these two records, and I'll show you in some other records as well in a minute, some of which may potentially reflect solar variability, which may play a more dominant role during the Holocene when sort of other boundary conditions were less significant. Let's see. Let's go on from there. Okay. So there's a new record that was just published in Science in November. It's Zhang et al., and this is a record from a Heshang Cave stalagmite, which is shown here. It's a very small stalagmite, but it's extremely well dated, and this was dated in Larry Edwards' lab by Heshang. And it has 20 uranium-thorium dates with an average uranium-thorium age error of around 2 years, which is quite spectacular, actually. Although I think the actual error in the age model is somewhat larger than that, but still, it's extremely well dated and grew over the past 1,800 years and has been sampled and measured at a resolution of about 2.5 years per sample. And so that record is shown here now in green, and this has relatively smaller fluctuations, only about a per mil and a half, 1.5 per mil range or so over this time period, which makes sense. But some of the major features that we can observe in this record are that during this medieval warm period, which is a period of relatively high solar activity and relatively warm conditions in much of the northern hemisphere, we see relatively strong monsoon conditions. This dotted line is showing you the mean delta 18 value. And during the Little Ice Age, which followed, we see relatively dry conditions over that time period. And there's a certain, one of the points of this paper was actually a comparison of some of these abrupt or prolonged dry periods in this region with some of the major cultural changes which happened in China. So you can see here the end of the Tang Dynasty was characterized by a prolonged period of relatively weak monsoon, which they've we've coined the late Tang warm weak monsoon period. And that's seen in a number of records around 940 years ago. Or sorry, around 940 AD, I mean. And then there's also a weakening at the end of the Yuan dynasty and at the end of the Ming dynasty, which are seen in a number of records. So this is possible evidence that climate changes may have contributed to some of these cultural changes. It's not saying that it was the main driver, but it very well could have played a role, as dry conditions in this period were likely to lead to droughts and famines and social upheaval. So we can compare that record with the same period from the Heshang Cave stalagmite, which is located, again, farther south. And if you look here now in that same record from Wangxiang is in blue now, and the HS4 record is in red. And you can, again, see some similarities. In particular, the late Tang weak monsoon period shows up in both records, and this mid-14th century weakening seems much more severe in Heshang. So we actually see a higher amplitude variability in the Heshang record, which suggests that perhaps more of the rainfall variability may have been happening south of that region rather than in between the two sites, which is something I won't go into detail about, but if you're interested, I can explain that. Okay, so to end this first part, and I'll just show you a little bit from the second part, the Chinese speleothem delta 18 variations are synchronous with changes in northern hemisphere summer insolation, suggesting that this is the dominant control on these sort of orbital timescales, but that millennial scale monsoon variations largely reflect abrupt shifts in ITCZ position, which might be linked to sea ice and associated northern hemisphere ice cover and associated feedbacks like ocean circulation changes. And then even in the Holocene, we see significant decadal decennial scale monsoon variations through a variety of mechanisms, such as solar and potentially El Nino-related effects and some effects related to North Atlantic climate. So abrupt changes can happen during warmer periods, and so we need to really thoroughly investigate this Holocene variability in order to understand what might happen in the future. Okay, so the second part of my research is actually trying to develop new proxies and look at higher resolution records. Speleothems are one of the best targets for looking at sub-annual resolution paleoclimate because they often have these annual laminae and they grow relatively fast, so we can sample them at very high spatial and temporal resolution. So this is, again, showing you that HS4 stalagmite split in half now, an example of some of these annual laminae. They occur as these dark light couplets, basically. And we've taken a few approaches to try and get seasonal resolution climate records out of these. One is modern calibration approach, which is also important for understanding the interpretation of the long-term proxy records. A second approach is studying the seasonal changes in the stalagmites. And then a third is actually laboratory studies, which I don't think I'll have time to talk about, which is actually growing calcite in the lab under controlled conditions to investigate the effects of things like temperature, CO2, degassing rates, etc., drip rate on speleothem calcite geochemistry. Okay, so part of the motivation for this is that we actually initially looked at the HS4 stalagmite, and some of the data is shown here. This is showing you uranium, calcium, magnesium, calcium, carbon, and oxygen isotopes across a 7 millimeter section of HS4. And we observed very clear seasonal cycles in a number of these proxies, and actually several of the proxies were strongly correlated with one another. In particular, magnesium and carbon, as well as things like strontium and barium, were all very positively correlated with one another. And so this should be recording something about how the environment of the cave is varying on a seasonal basis. This was published in EPSL in 2006 with a discussion of some of the mechanisms that might explain those cycles, which I'll summarize briefly here. So we've already talked about what can control delta 18. It can be seasonal changes in the drip water composition, the amount of mixing between different water reservoirs, possibly. Seasonal changes in cave temperature can also affect delta 18, and then changes in kinetic effects could have a role. Seasonal changes in delta C13 are known to be often affected by CO2 degassing related processes. When that water enters the cave and it degasses CO2, the carbon-12 degasses slightly quicker than the carbon-13. And therefore, this causes fractionation. The DIC, the dissolved inorganic carbon, gets heavier as degassing and calcite precipitation continue. And so if you have any prior calcite precipitation on the roof of the cave, if you have a stalactite, for example, or somewhere within fractures in the limestone, any degassing and calcite precipitation will lead to enrichment in delta C13. And if this varies on a seasonal basis, then you might get seasonal cycles. A similar process is calcite precipitation efficiency, where this is not actually relying on something to happen above the cave, but this might actually occur on the surface of the stalagmite, where if you have the water sitting there for longer and degassing more during some periods than others, then you might generate a seasonal cycle that way, in the same sort of way. Also, some caves are ventilated seasonally. They might accumulate CO2 and not exchange their air that much with the outside atmosphere. And then if you have a temperature gradient, for example, that changes seasonally, then you might have episodes where the whole cave air ventilates with the atmosphere relatively quickly, and that will affect the rate that CO2 degasses in the cave, if that makes sense. And also things that happen in the soil and kinetics might affect that as well. And then trace element variations and their relationship with things like temperature and growth rate have been widely investigated in certain things like forams or in certain inorganic calcite. And it's been shown that there is a relationship between certain elements and temperature. For example, magnesium, calcium, and calcite. The incorporation of magnesium and calcite is known to be temperature dependent. It's thought that the incorporation of strontium into calcite is dependent on growth rate, as well as some other elements. So these are things which actually affect the partitioning of the trace elements into the speleothem. And then we have processes that in the soil or mixing or other processes like this prior calcite precipitation. Again, as if you precipitate calcite and you have elements which strongly prefer to stay in the solution, so they have a very low distribution coefficient, then as calcite precipitates, those elements will be enriched in the water because they're preferentially kept out of the calcite. And therefore, you would expect to see perhaps a correlation between some of these elements and the C13, which are also affected by this prior calcite precipitation. Okay, so there's been a lot of work that's been done on this, and there's a really good review paper by Fairchild et al. In 2006 in Earth Science Reviews, which covers all of these mechanisms. But the ultimate thing is that the seasonal cycles ultimately reflect seasonal variability, either in drip water chemistry or in speleothem growth conditions, so temperature, drip rate, calcite growth rate, kinetics. So in order to unravel these different effects, you really need to do a very thorough and detailed study of the modern cave system, where you can fully characterize all the potential controls. And that's what we've done. This is really the work of Chaoyang Hu and several Chinese PhD and master's students, as well as a local fisherman who lives nearby and helps us with some sample collection. So this cave system has been monitored now since 2003, so coming up on 5 years, I guess, of data where we have monthly measurements, which include actually calcite precipitated on glass slides underneath the drip where we got that HS4 stalagmite, and those are changed every month. So we have monthly calcite samples, as well as a number of other measurements of the drip water chemistry that are conducted on a monthly basis. Every 10 days, we collect drip water samples, measure the drip rate, and also measure the PCO2 within the cave. And every 2 hours or so, we have automatic loggers, which measure temperature, humidity, and actually the drip rate in the cave. And a lot of this was published last year, again, in a special speleology journal. And the results, some of the results of that are shown here now. These seasonal cycles then in the speleothem are likely to reflect seasonal changes which might be happening in the cave system. So when we look at the climate and environment of the modern cave system, we see actually a very clear temperature cycle in this cave, which is not, because it's a fairly shallow and open cave, it actually does have about a 6 degree Celsius temperature cycle, which is directly in phase with the temperature outside the cave, which is shown up here, but damped relative to that signal. We also see, shown in blue here, is rainfall, millimeters per day, instrumental rainfall from a nearby site. And shown here in green is drip rate, which actually shows sort of a threshold-like behavior, where as the summer monsoon onsets and rainfall increases, at some point we get an abrupt increase in drip rate, followed by sort of this exponential decay, and then an abrupt increase and then decay. What's interesting, though, is that in 2006, there was actually a very weak monsoon that summer, and so the rainfall never exceeded this threshold, and so we never actually saw this abrupt increase in rainfall. We did see it in 2008, actually, but unfortunately I don't have the data on here to show you. We also actually see a seasonal cycle in the growth rate of calcite in the cave, which we think is largely controlled by temperature, not by drip rate, because you see we still see this peak in that summer when we didn't actually have a drip rate peak. So that's one useful thing with having these different measurements in the cave. We can sort of rule out some of the controls. We've also looked at how the geochemistry of the water and the calcite varies seasonally. And you can see here, this is a delta D and delta 18 of the water. And we see some noise, but we don't see clear seasonal cycles over this 3-year period. But if we look at the mean values, they're very close to those which are predicted from rainfall data from the region. So we think that on average the drip water is reflecting the annual mean rainfall at that site. Shown here now is the delta 18 of the glass slides, showing a clear seasonal cycle here. And one interesting thing is that because we have the drip water delta 18 data and we have the temperature data over the same time period, we can actually calculate what the delta 18 of the calcite should be. And if we do that, we get a very nice match, which shows that this calcite is deposited in equilibrium. The seasonal cycles are primarily controlled by temperature, whereas I've already talked about the low-frequency, longer-term variations, which are reflecting changes in rainfall delta 18 related to monsoon intensity. So oxygen, depending on what time scale you look at, can either tell you potentially about temperature or seasonal temperature cycles and rainfall. Another useful aspect of having these seasonal cycles is that they provide a useful chronological tool, because we can define we don't expect the timing of the seasonal temperature cycle to change significantly, and therefore we can define the highest delta 18 periods as January, the coldest month, and the lowest delta 18 values as July. So we actually have something now which we can use as a marker, and we can use this to define the timescale for the other proxies that we measure. Okay, I think I'm just going to say a little bit about magnesium calcium and then finish up. So shown here now in blue, we've done a similar thing with magnesium calcium basically. And so in blue is drip water magnesium calcium. We see a bit of a seasonal cycle, though it's not super clear, with lower magnesium calcium ratios in the drip water in the summer months. And we see the opposite trend actually in the calcite with relatively higher magnesium calcium values in the calcite in the summer months. So clearly the calcite is not, the calcite signal is not controlled dominantly by the drip water composition. Instead, we suggest that it may be a temperature effect as well, because we know that the magnesium incorporation is temperature dependent. So this actually was useful because it sort of there's this common, in the speleothem community, there's this common idea that higher magnesium calcium and strontium calcium, all these other things, which might reflect more prior calcite precipitation, should occur during dry periods, and therefore, in general, these might be interpreted as a proxy for rainfall. But we're actually showing at this cave that we have more negative values during the summer, which is the wettest month. So maybe it's not prior calcite precipitation, something else, or if it is, it's not operating the way that we thought it would. Anyway, there's a number of magnesium calcium calibrations out there that we can compare this data to, again, because we have the magnesium calcium data and we have the temperature data. If we do that sort of test, we can get this relationship here, which actually, I don't have the graph, I think, in here, but it does compare pretty well with previous estimates of the magnesium calcium temperature relationship. And I think I'm going to just skip through this. Okay, I'll show one bit. So basically, what we did is then we wanted to look at in more detail at the speleothem records, and so we looked at a couple of different speleothems from different time periods, from the last glacial maximum, from the mid-Holocene, and in the modern section. So I'll just show you the mid-Holocene section because it looks very similar actually between all three time periods. And so this is that data I showed you earlier. And if what we did was actually stacked a number of these cycles on top of one another to try and get at what an average cycle might be, and also just to look at the relative timing more clearly between the different proxies. And so to do that, we calculated correlation coefficients of those composite cycles. And you can see here that there's a very strong positive correlation between magnesium, all the positive ones are in red, magnesium, strontium, barium, and delta C13 are all positively correlated quite strongly, whereas delta 18 is less strongly but negatively correlated with these proxies. And what we did was actually use the oxygen isotopes to define the annual timescale, so to define what we call months. Although because growth rate is likely not constant throughout the year, these probably aren't really months. But at least we have two tie points. We have the January and July tie point. So anyway, if you plot the delta 18 then and the magnesium calcium versus month, you do see this anti-phase type behavior where the highest magnesium calcium and therefore strontium, barium, and delta C13 are all occurring during the summer, which does suggest that there might be a common control, but we're still trying to sort out what that might be, because while temperature would explain the magnesium, it doesn't necessarily explain the strontium, barium, and carbon isotopes. So it may be a prior calcite precipitation-like mechanism. But that's still very much a work in progress. Anyway, I'm just going to flip through these. But we did the same exercise for these other 2 time periods, and we found exactly the same relationships, more or less. And so just to conclude then, speleothem, magnesium, strontium, barium, and carbon, delta C13, are positively correlated, highest in the summer, and are negatively correlated with delta 18. And this is true for the last glacial maximum, the mid-Holocene, and modern speleothems. So the same mechanisms were likely operating at each of these times. And so we're working on different ways where we can combine the proxies in order to potentially get out something more useful in terms of paleoclimate. The oxygen and magnesium are controlled largely by temperature and can be used to constrain the timing of the seasonal growth. And the other proxies likely reflect some other within cave controls. And then the controls it's clear that the controls on the geochemistry vary on different timescales. The seasonal scale of variability reflects completely different processes than the lower frequency variability. And so this is something we really need to understand when reconstructing climate from these. We need to be aware of this complicating factor. Okay? All right, thanks. Sorry for going so long.